The last haul, a journey into the unknown. The hum of the engine served as a steady lullaby beneath him as he adjusted the rearview mirror one final time, the neon glow of Dallas bleeding into the pre-dawn sky. He was a man of routine, methodical and dependable, the kind of driver who knew every inch of his rig like the back of his calloused hands. The CB radio crackled with the voices of fellow truckers, their words weaving through the static like ghosts of the open road. But tonight, something felt different, not in the way of storms or mechanical trouble, but in the quiet, creeping sense that the world beyond the windshield was holding its breath. Dallas never truly slept, and as he rolled past the towering silhouettes of downtown, the city exhaled its last gasps of nightlife, streetlights flickering, the occasional wail of a siren, the scent of diesel and damp asphalt clinging to the air. He had made this run 100 times before, I-20 East, a straight shot through the heart of Texas, then beyond. The route was etched into his memory, a path so familiar it bordered on ritual. Yet, as the skyline shrank in his mirrors, replaced by the endless stretch of highway, a strange unease settled in his chest. The road ahead was a black ribbon, unspooling into the unknown, and for the first time in years, he hesitated before pressing the accelerator. His hands, rough from decades of gripping the wheel, tightened imperceptibly. The dashboard lights cast eerie shadows across the cab, transforming the mundane into something ominous. He thought of the thermos of coffee beside him, still warm, and of the photograph tucked into the sun visor, a smiling woman, her arms slung around a younger version of himself, their faces sun-kissed and unburdened. The past was a weight he carried lightly, but tonight it pressed harder. The CB radio fell silent. Even the stars seemed dimmer, as if the sky itself had pulled a veil over its secrets. By the time he reached the state line, the first hints of dawn were bleeding into the horizon, painting the fields in hues of blood and gold. He should have felt relief. The worst of the night behind him, the promise of daylight ahead, but the unease lingered, coiling tighter with every mile. The road was empty, too empty. No headlights in the distance, no rumble of engines, just the monotonous drone of his own tires against the pavement. And then, somewhere between the last exit and the next, the radio hissed to life, one final time. A voice, distorted and faint, whispered words he couldn't quite make out before dissolving into static dot. He never made it to the drop-off. No distress call, no skid marks on the asphalt, no trace of struggle, just a trucker, his rig, and 200 miles of road that swallowed them whole. 5 years later, when the fisherman dragged the ocean floor and found his cab resting in the silent dark, the mystery only deepened. How does a man and his 18 wheels vanish from a highway and reappear in the abyss? The answer lies buried with him, in the spaces between what we know and what we fear to ask. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture the last stretch of road he saw, the last breath of night air he took. Can you feel it? The weight of the unknown pressing in. Because somewhere out there, the road remembers, and it's waiting to tell its story. He was a man of routine, a quiet force in the lives of those who loved him. Every Tuesday, like clockwork, he'd pull into the diner, just off I-30, sliding into the same cracked vinyl booth where the waitress, Marla, already had his coffee waiting. Black, no sugar, the steam curling into the dim light of dawn. His hands, rough from years of gripping the wheel, would cradle the mug as he listened to the hum of early morning chatter, the clink of silverware against plates, the distant rumble of engines on the highway. To the regulars, he was just another trucker, another face in the endless parade of men and women who kept America moving. But to his daughter, he was the voice on the other end of the phone every night at 9:15, without fail. Made it to Little Rock, sweetheart. Roads are slick, but I'll be home by Friday. His words were steady and reliable, just like the man himself. His life was built on the rhythm of the road, a metronome of diesel and deadlines. For 23 years, he'd hauled everything from steel beams to frozen pizzas. And hymns. His rig a second home, its cab lined with faded photos of his wife in a sundress, his son's Little League trophy, a dog-eared map with routes marked in red ink. He knew every rest stop between Dallas and Denver, every truck stop where the pie was still warm, every stretch of highway where the cell signal dropped like a stone. His coworkers called him the machine, not because he was cold, but because he was predictable. If he said he'd be there, he was. If he said the load would arrive by noon, it did. There was comfort in that, a quiet pride in being the kind of man people could depend on. But beneath the routine, there were cracks. Small, almost imperceptible. His wife had started noticing the way his eyes lingered a little too long on the weather reports. How he'd mutter about that stretch near Oklahoma, where the winds came out of nowhere. His best friend, another driver, once joked that he had a sixth sense for bad roads. But it wasn't a joke. Not really. There was something in the way he'd grip the wheel a little tighter, when the skies turned the color of bruises, the way his voice would drop to a murmur, when he talked about the things he'd seen on the night runs. Sometimes, he'd said once, over a beer that went warm between them, you pass a place, and you just know it's watching you back. And then there were the calls home, the ones that didn't quite sound like him. His daughter would later tell investigators about the last time she heard his voice, how it had been strained, like he was speaking through water. Something's off tonight, kiddo, but I'll be fine, always am. The line had crackled, and for a second, she swore she heard something else, something low and guttural, like the groan of metal under pressure. She'd laughed it off then. Dad, you're scaring me. His chuckle was forced. Nah, just the wind. What no one knew was that he'd been keeping a notebook, tucked under the sleeper berth, its pages filled with dates and coordinates, scribbled observations about things that didn't make sense, headlights where there were no roads, shadows that moved against the wind, the way his CB radio would sometimes pick up voices that weren't there. The last entry was dated the night he vanished. It read simply, "They're not letting me leave." The ink was smudged, as if written in haste, or in fear. Now, the question lingers. What did he see out there? What had he carried in that rig, night after night, that he never spoke of? The road doesn't give up its secrets easily. But the ocean always talks, eventually. And 5 years later, when the fisherman pulled his truck from the black depths, its cab empty, its engine still running, the water whispered something terrible. He wasn't alone when he went under, and whatever took him, it's still hungry. The morning of October 12th, 2002, dawned with a sky heavy with intent. Thick, iron-gray clouds sagging low over the highways of Texas, as if the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. The air was dense, clinging to the skin like a second layer, carrying the sharp metallic tang of an impending storm. By the time he pulled out of the Dallas truck stop, the first fat raindrops had begun to splatter against the windshield of his rig, each one leaving a dark, fleeting mark before the wipers dragged them into oblivion. The forecast had warned of severe weather, but for a man who had spent half his life on the road, storms were just another variable in the equation of the haul. Yet this one felt different. The way the wind howled through the gaps in the trailer's seals, the way the headlights cut through the gloom, only to be swallowed by the darkness beyond. It was as if the world beyond the cab was slowly dissolving into something unseen, something unknown. His last call home came at 3:17 p.m., just as the storm broke in earnest. His wife would later say his voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, something she couldn't name at the time, a hesitation perhaps, or the faintest tremor of unease. Gonna be a slow go with this weather, he murmured, the static on the line crackling like distant lightning. But I'll be in Louisiana by midnight. Love you. The words were routine, the kind exchanged 1,000 times before, but this time they lingered in the air long after the call ended. His daughter, then just 12, would remember how her mother stood frozen in the kitchen, the phone still pressed to her ear, staring at the wall as if she could see through it, to the storm, to the highway, to him. The roads that day were treacherous. I-20, usually a straight shot through the pine forests of East Texas, had become a gauntlet of standing water and sudden gusts that sent tractor trailers swaying like reeds in a hurricane. Other drivers would later recall the eerie silence on the CB radio that afternoon. No chatter, no warnings, just the occasional burst of static, as if the storm had swallowed every voice but its own. He was last seen at a way station near Marshall, his rig idling under the flickering fluorescent lights, while he grabbed a coffee and a sandwich. The cashier would tell investigators he seemed distracted, his eyes darting to the windows every few seconds, as if expecting something or someone to emerge from the rain. Then he was gone, his taillights disappearing into the downpour, his rig merging with the shadows of the storm. And then, nothing. No distress call, no skid marks on the pavement. No witnesses to a crash, a detour, or a breakdown. Just the storm, the road, and the growing, gnawing certainty that something on that stretch of highway had gone terribly wrong. The weather would clear by dawn, leaving behind only the usual wreckage of fallen branches and flooded ditches. But of him, and of the 18 wheels that carried his livelihood, there would be no trace. Not for 5 long, agonizing years. Not until the ocean itself decided to surrender its secret, and by then, the questions would only have deepened. Because how does a man and 40 tons of steel simply vanish into the night? What waits in the spaces between the rain and the road, between the last words spoken and the silence that follows? And what does it mean when the only answer the world offers is the cold, unblinking depths of the sea? Perhaps the real mystery isn't where he went, but what found him first. The clock struck midnight, and the silence in the Carter household was shattered, not by the chime of the hour, but by the deafening absence of a phone call that should have come hours before. His wife, Linda, stood frozen in the dim glow of the kitchen light, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the receiver. She had dialed his cell 3 times already, each attempt met with the same hollow ring, the same voicemail greeting, his voice still warm, still there, yet utterly unreachable. The coffee in her mug had long gone cold, a bitter mirror to the dread coiling in her stomach. He would have called, that was the rule. No matter the delay, no matter the load, he always called. By dawn, the unease had metastasized into something darker. Linda's hands shook as she scribbled his description on a notepad. 6'2", salt and pepper stubble, a scar above his left eyebrow from the time he'd laughed too hard and walked into a trailer hitch. She recounted the route he'd taken, the way his voice had cracked slightly over the CB radio when he'd mentioned the storm rolling in near Shreveport. Just some rain, he'd said. I'll be home by 10. The dispatch logs would later confirm his last transmission. A routine check-in at 8:47 p.m., his rig humming steady on I-20 East. After that, nothing. Not a skid mark, not a witness, not even a whisper of static on the airwaves. The police station smelled of stale coffee and antiseptic, the fluorescent lights buzzing like a swarm of insects as Linda clutched her daughter's hand. 8-year-old Megan had drawn him a picture that morning, a stick-figure trucker with a too big smile. The words "Drive safe," Daddy scrawled in crayon beneath it. Now she pressed it against her chest. As the officer asked questions that felt like accusations. Had he seemed distracted? Any financial troubles? Enemies? Linda's voice broke. He was hauling lumber. Lumber. There's no enemies in lumber. But the doubt had already taken root. What if he'd lied? What if the storm wasn't just rain? What if the road had swallowed him whole? Search teams fanned out like a desperate pulse. State troopers combed the interstate, their flashlights carving arcs through the pre-dawn fog. Helicopters thrummed overhead, their spotlights turning the pine forests into a strobing nightmare. At the truck stop, where he'd last fueled up, a grizzled cashier squinted at the grainy security footage. There he was, paying in cash, joking about the weather, his boots leaving muddy prints on the linoleum. Then the screen went dark. No struggle, no hesitation, just gone. The only clue? A single, unanswered question, scrawled in the margin of a logbook. Why would he turn south? Back home, the phone became a torment. Every ring was a false hope, every silence a fresh wound. His brother Jake paced the living room, his work boots tracking dirt across the carpet he'd helped lay just last summer. Truckers don't vanish, he muttered. Not like this. But the hours stretched into days, and the days into a void. The news reports grew shorter, the search parties thinner. Linda would later say, the worst moment wasn't the not knowing. It was the way the world kept moving, the way the sun still rose, the way Megan's teacher asked, with infuriating gentleness, if she'd like to make a new Father's Day card. And then, 5 years later, the ocean would give up its secret. But that's a story for another night. For now, close your eyes and ask yourself, how many times have you driven down a lonely highway at dusk, the headlights cutting through the dark like a blade? How many times have you glanced in the rear view, just to be sure no one was following? The road doesn't forget, and neither, it seems, does the sea. The search that never slept. The days stretched into weeks, and the weeks into months, yet the question lingered like a shadow over the small Texas town. Where was he? Authorities launched one of the most exhaustive investigations in the region's history, but the deeper they dug, the more the case seemed to dissolve into thin air. Detectives combed through toll booth records, scrutinized fuel receipts, and retraced every mile of his intended route, only to find dead ends at every turn. The truck's last known location? A rest stop outside Shreveport, Louisiana, where surveillance footage captured nothing but the hum of passing semis and the flicker of neon signs. Then, silence. Law enforcement left no stone unturned. The FBI was called in, their agents poring over cell tower pings that led nowhere, interviewing fellow drivers who swore they'd seen nothing unusual. One veteran trooper, his voice still thick with frustration in a 2004 interview, admitted, "We chased every ghost lead, every whispered rumor, but it was like he'd vanished into the damn ether." The community rallied, plastering flyers on diner windows and truck stop bulletin boards, their hope fading with each passing season. Vigils were held under the glow of highway lights, where wives of long-haul drivers clutched rosaries and prayed for a miracle. Yet the years ground on, and the case grew colder. Theories spiraled: foul play, a staged disappearance, even the unlikely specter of a life erased by choice. But the one thing no one could explain, the absence of the truck itself. A rig that size doesn't just disappear, unless it was never meant to be found. And then, half a decade later, the ocean gave up its secret. But by then, the question had changed. It was no longer where he had gone, but how, and why the truth had stayed buried for so long. The weight of the unknown. The clock on the wall of the Martins' kitchen had stopped at 3:17 a.m., the exact time Linda last heard her husband's voice over the crackling static of his CB radio. Just passing through Shreveport, love. Be home by dawn. That promise, like the ticking of the frozen clock, became a cruel echo in the years that followed. Because dawn came, and then another, and another, each one stretching into weeks, then months, then years of silence. The authorities had combed highways, questioned witnesses, and chased dead-end leads. But for Linda and their two sons, the absence of answers only deepened the wound. What do you cling to when the world insists someone can simply vanish without a trace? The boys, just 12 and 14, when their father disappeared, grew into young men in a house haunted by his ghost. Jake, the older of the two, took to sitting in the driveway after school, staring at the empty space where his father's rig should have been. He'd press his palms into the oil-stained concrete, as if the weight of his hands could summon an explanation. His brother, Ethan, stopped speaking for months, until the day he finally whispered to his mother, "What if he's out there waiting for us to find him?" The question hung between them like a curse, because that was the cruelty of it. Not knowing meant they couldn't grieve. And without grief, there was no release. Linda kept his favorite flannel shirt hanging by the door, still smelling faintly of diesel and coffee. She'd bury her face in it some nights, inhaling the ghost of him, wondering if the ocean had claimed more than just his truck. Had he fought against the rising water? Had he called out for them in the dark? The not knowing was a slow poison, seeping into every birthday, every holiday, every milestone he missed. Friends stopped asking. The community moved on. But in that house, time had split in two. The life they'd had, and the hollow one they endured after Dot. Then came the nightmares. Vivid, suffocating dreams where the phone would ring, and it would be him, voice strained and distant, whispering coordinates before the line went dead. Linda would jolt awake, heart hammering, convinced it was real. She'd dial the number for the Coast Guard before she was fully conscious, only to be met with the same weary sighs, the same "ma'am, we've checked. There's nothing." But how could there be nothing? A man doesn't just dissolve into the air. A truck doesn't drive itself into the abyss. Dot, and yet the abyss was exactly where it had gone. Dot, 5 years of searching, had yielded nothing but exhaustion, and a growing dread that the truth might be worse than the unknown. Because if his rig was found, when it was found, what would it say about those final moments? Would it bring closure? Or would it only deepen the horror of what had happened in the dark, where no one could hear him scream? The Martins weren't the only ones left in limbo. Co-workers at the trucking company still swapped stories about the night he vanished, their voices low over greasy diner coffee. He wasn't the type to just up and leave. Something took him, and in those words, the unspoken fear, if it could happen to him, a man who knew every back road between Dallas and New Orleans, what was to stop it from happening to any of them? So they waited. Not with hope, not anymore, but with a terrible gnawing certainty that the answer was coming, and when it did, it would change everything. Again, 5 years had passed, since the night the highway swallowed him whole, since the radio transmissions fell silent, and the taillights of his rig faded into the Texas dark. The world had moved on, but the ocean remembers, and on a morning so still, it seemed the earth itself had paused to hold its breath. The sea would surrender its secret Dot. The Gulf waters that day were unnaturally calm, a glassy expanse stretching to the horizon, like a mirror cracked only by the occasional ripple of a forgotten current. Captain Elias Voss had fished these waters for 30 years, and even he had never seen the bay so quiet. His first mate, Darius Cole, a man who spoke in grunts and knew the language of the tides better than his own name, leaned against the bow, squinting at the depth finder. The screen flickered, then stuttered. Something massive lay below, its outline jagged and wrong, like a wound in the silt. Not a shipwreck, not a reef. The sonic pulse painted the shape of a cab, the skeletal remains of a trailer, its edges softened by time and salt, but unmistakable in their purpose. A truck, not sunk by storm or collision, but placed there, as if the ocean had reached up one night and plucked it from the road itself. Elias cut the engine. The silence that followed wasn't just absence of sound, it was the kind of quiet that presses against your eardrums, that makes your pulse thud loud enough to hear. Darius didn't swear, didn't even breathe hard. He just stared at the depth, reading, then at the water, as if expecting the surface to ripple with an explanation. But the sea offered none, only the slow, deliberate creak of the boat shifting on the swell, and the cold certainty that whatever lay below wasn't meant to be found. They suited up in silence, the weight of the diving gear suddenly heavier than it had any right to be. The water closed over Elias first, the temperature dropping like a blade between his ribs. Visibility was better than it should have been. No sediment, no murk, just an eerie clarity that let the beams of their flashlights carve through the blue like searchlights over a crime scene. And there it was. The rig sat upright, as if parked, its wheels buried in the sand. The cab tilted slightly, like a man slumping in defeat. The license plate was gone. The company logo on the door had been scrubbed away by time and tide. But the rusted outline of a single word remained, just visible beneath the coral. Dallas. Elias reached out, then stopped. The truck wasn't empty. Something moved in the cab. Not a fish, not the sway of kelp. A shadow, dense and deliberate, shifting behind the cracked windshield. Darius's voice crackled over the comms, raw with something that wasn't fear. Not yet. That ain't right. No, it wasn't. Because 5 years underwater should have reduced a man to bones. And yet, the figure behind the wheel didn't look like bones. It looked like waiting. The radio on the boat had started to hiss before they even broke the surface. Static. Then a voice, garbled, distant, but unmistakably human. 3 words, repeated, "You found me." And then nothing. Just the wind picking up at last, and the first waves slapping against the hull like hands trying to pull them back down. What do you do when the ocean gives you an answer you weren't meant to hear? When the missing don't stay lost? The fishermen would spend the rest of their lives wondering if they'd been meant to find him at all, or if something down there had wanted to be found. But one thing was certain, the truck hadn't sunk by accident, and whatever had put it there wasn't done with its story yet. The net dragged against something massive, something that didn't belong in the quiet abyss beneath their boat. The fishermen had spent decades reading the ocean's whispers, its currents, its moods, the way it yielded or resisted. But this was different. This was a silence that screamed. The ropes groaned under an unnatural weight, taut as piano wires, and when the first glint of rusted metal broke the surface, time seemed to fracture. Not a shipwreck, not debris, a truck, a semi-truck, its cab still eerily intact, its grill a jagged maw of salt-corroded steel, staring back at them from the depths like a relic of some forgotten catastrophe. Their breaths came shallow as the realization coiled around them. This wasn't just flotsam, this was a tomb, the oldest of the crew, a man whose hands had pulled countless catches from these waters. Let the net slip through his fingers as if it had turned to ice. His voice cracked when he spoke, barely a rasp above the lapping waves. That ain't supposed to be here. And it wasn't. Not 20 miles off the coast. Not submerged in a place where the ocean floor should have been smooth sand. Not the twisted skeleton of an 18-wheeler. Its wheels still chained in place. Its trailer door slightly ajar, as if something had tried to escape or been taken. The younger men fumbled for their radios, but their fingers trembled. One of them, a kid barely out of his teens, swore he saw something move in the murk behind the truck's shattered windshield. A shadow, a trick of the light, the ghost of a man who'd vanished half a decade ago. The air turned thick, cloying, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums until you hear your own pulse. They knew the stories, of course. Every coastal town had them. Truckers who drove into the night and never came back. Highways that swallowed men whole. But this was proof. This was the ocean, giving back a secret it had no right to keep. And then the questions came, unbidden, gnawing. How does a rig end up here? What force or what hand could have carried it so far from the road? The water around them seemed to darken, the horizon pulling in like a held breath. They didn't want to touch it, didn't want to know what might still be inside. But they couldn't look away, because somewhere in the rust and the silt and the crushing black of the deep, there were answers. And answers, they knew, were the most dangerous things to dredge up. The radio call crackled through the static-laden air of the coastal dispatch office, a voice strained with urgency cutting through the hum of routine transmissions. This isn't a drill. We've got a semi-truck submerged off the breakers, license plates still visible. You're gonna want to see this. The words hung heavy, each syllable dripping with the weight of something long buried, both literally and metaphorically. For 5 years, the case of the vanished truck driver had lingered in the cold files of the Dallas PD, a ghost story whispered between shifts, a puzzle missing its final piece. But now, The ocean had decided to speak. Within hours, the dispatch erupted into controlled chaos. Detectives, who had long since moved on to other cases, found themselves staring at grainy sonar images, their breath shallow as the outline of a Freightliner Coronado materialized on the screen. Its cab intact, its trailer skewed at an unnatural angle, as if the sea had swallowed it mid-motion. The VIN number was partially obscured by coral growth, but the first 6 digits matched the missing rig. A collective silence fell over the room. This wasn't just a recovery, it was an exhumation. The operation demanded precision. A marine salvage team was mobilized, their equipment groaning under the weight of the task ahead. Divers suited up, their flashlights cutting through the murky depths as they descended, the pressure mounting with every foot. Above the surface, the Coast Guard circled, their spotlights casting eerie reflections on the water, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath. Back on shore, the lead investigator traced the route the driver had taken. One last time, a stretch of I-20 that ended abruptly at a rest stop near Louisiana. No skid marks, no witnesses, just a man, his truck, and a 200-mile gap between the last known location and the abyss that had claimed them both. Then came the question no one dared voice aloud. What else would they find inside? The truck's cab was sealed, its doors shut tight against the crushing dark. Had the driver been at the wheel when it went under? Or had something far more sinister unfolded before the ocean took its due? The salvage crane hovered above the water, its cables taut, ready to pull the truth into the light. But as the first rusted metal groaned under the strain of resurrection, one thing became painfully clear. Some answers were never meant to surface. And yet, here it was, rising, forcing them all to look, to remember, to ask the one question that had haunted them for half a decade. What really happened out there? The families of the missing, waited, their hope as fragile as the barnacles clinging to the truck's chassis. The divers braced themselves, and the ocean, it watched, silent, as if daring them to solve the riddle it had kept for so long. The dawn broke over the Gulf Coast with a heavy silence, the kind that clings to the air when something unseen is about to surface. Beneath the steel-gray waves, the truck had waited, 5 years submerged in the crushing dark, its secrets locked away. But now, the moment had come. The retrieval operation was underway, and with it, a suffocating tension that coiled around every soul involved. The salvage team moved with deliberate precision, their voices clipped through radios, each word laced with the weight of what they might uncover. The crane groaned as it lowered the reinforced cables into the water, the winch straining against the ocean's resistance. This wasn't just another recovery, it was a reckoning. The families of the missing driver had waited half a decade for answers, their hope eroded by time, but never fully extinguished. Now, as the cables descended into the abyss, their hearts beat in unison with the rhythmic pulse of the machinery. But the ocean doesn't surrender its secrets easily. The current fought against the operation, tugging at the lines, threatening to snap them like brittle thread. Divers battled limited visibility, their flashlights cutting through murky water, revealing only fragments of the truck's rusted frame. Each adjustment to the rigging sent ripples of anxiety through the onlookers, law enforcement, Coast Guard, the driver's loved ones, all standing on the deck, their breath shallow, their eyes fixed on the water, as if willing it to release what it had taken. And then, a shift. The cables tautened, the winch screamed under the sudden weight, and for one agonizing second, the entire operation seemed to hang in the balance. Would the truck break free, or would the ocean claim it once more? The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant cry of a gull circling overhead. No one spoke, no one moved, because in that moment, they all understood the truth was rising, and with it, the end of a mystery that had haunted them for years. What would they find inside? Would there be closure, or only deeper questions? The answers lay just beneath the surface, waiting to be pulled into the light, and as the first glint of metal broke through the waves, the world seemed to hold its breath. The moment the crane's steel claws broke the ocean's surface, time seemed to suspend itself, each drop of water clinging to the rusted frame of the truck, as it emerged from the abyss, carried the weight of 5 years of silence. There it was, suspended in the salt-stung air, a relic of vanished hours, its once vibrant blue cab, now a skeletal husk, barnacled and bleached by the relentless tide. The recovery team stood frozen, their breath shallow, their gloves slick with more than just seawater. This wasn't just metal and rubber rising from the depths. It was the physical manifestation of a question that had haunted highways and dinner tables for half a decade. What happened to him? The winch groaned under the strain, a sound that mirrored the collective tension on the deck. As the truck was lowered onto the reinforced platform, the first thing they noticed was the driver's side window, still intact, still rolled up, as if the last person to touch it had done so in haste or in fear. The door, warped by pressure and time, resisted at first, then gave way with a shuddering creak. Inside, the cabin was a tomb of preserved details. The scent hit them first, not the briny tang of the ocean, but something older, something trapped, the faint, ghostly echo of diesel and stale coffee. The seat was still adjusted to the driver's preferred recline, the steering wheel worn smooth at the 9 and 3 positions, where his hands had rested on countless nights behind the wheel. And there, on the dashboard, a single, waterlogged photograph curled at the edges, a woman and 2 children, their smiles fixed in a moment that now felt like a cruel joke. Then came the realization, creeping in like the tide. The truck hadn't just ended up in the ocean. The damage told a story no one wanted to hear. The front bumper was crumpled inward, not from impact with the seabed, but from something far more deliberate. The brake lines had been severed cleanly, the ends frayed just enough to suggest human hands, not corrosion, and the logbook, soaked, its pages fused together, held its final entry in smudged ink. "Something's wrong. They're following me." The words hung in the air like the stench of rust, undeniable. For the team, the horror wasn't just in the discovery, but in the dawning comprehension of what it meant. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a tragic miscalculation of fatigue or weather. It was the end of a chase, the final act of a story that had begun long before the truck ever left Dallas. As they stood there, the wind whipping the tarps around the recovered rig, one of the divers removed his helmet and wiped his face with a trembling hand. He'd pulled bodies from wrecks before, but this was different. This was a man who had fought, who had known, and whose last moments had been spent not in the blind panic of drowning, but in the cold certainty of betrayal. Now, the truck sat on that deck like an accusation, its secrets spilled, but its truth still half buried. The families would get their answers, yes, but at what cost? Some questions, once asked, can't be unasked. Some truths, once seen, can't be unseen. And as the rig was tarped once more, this time to be hauled ashore under the watchful eyes of law enforcement, the unspoken question lingered. If this is what happened to him, who else knows? The weight of the unknown, and the crushing truth that followed. 5 years, 60 months of unanswered calls, of birthdays marked by absence, of holidays where an empty chair at the table spoke louder than any toast. For the family of the missing truck driver, time had stretched into something unbearable, a limbo between hope and despair, where every ringing phone carried the potential to shatter their world. And then, in a single, suffocating moment, the ocean surrendered its secret, not with mercy, but with finality. The rig had been found, and with it, the cruel confirmation of what their hearts had feared, but their minds refused to accept. The news arrived like a physical blow. There was no gentle way to deliver it, no softening the edges of a truth that had been submerged in salt and silence for half a decade. Imagine the mother, her hands trembling as she clutched the phone, her breath catching in her throat as the words registered. We found his truck. Not we found him. Not he's coming home. Just the hollow echo of metal and rust, a tomb sealed by the sea. Her knees gave way, not from weakness, but from the sheer weight of a grief that had been held at bay for so long, only to rush in now with devastating force. And then came the questions, the relentless, gnawing questions that no recovery team, no coroner, no well-meaning officer could answer. How? The mind reeled at the impossibility of it. A truck, a massive hulking machine meant for highways and rest stops, not the crushing depths of the ocean. Why? Was it an accident, a desperate act, or something far darker, something that had lured him off course into the waiting arms of the abyss? The not knowing was a torment all its own, a puzzle with pieces scattered across time and tide, just out of reach. Yet beneath the shock, beneath the grief that threatened to pull them under, there was something else, something fragile but undeniable. Closure, not the kind that brings peace, but the kind that brings certainty. The agonizing limbo was over. There would be no more wondering if he'd walk through the door, no more jumping at the sound of a diesel engine in the distance. The ocean had taken him, and now it had returned his story. Not all of it, not nearly enough, but enough to begin the painful, necessary work of letting go. For the children he left behind, now older, their faces bearing the quiet resilience of those who have grown up too fast, the discovery was a paradox, a wound reopened, yet finally given the chance to heal. They would never hear his voice again, never feel his calloused hands ruffling their hair, but they could stand at the water's edge and say, "This is where it ended." And in that brutal honesty, there was a strange, terrible freedom. The truck, pulled from its watery grave, became more than evidence. It was a relic, a silent witness to a journey that had veered into the unthinkable. And as it sat on the dock, dripping with seawater and secrets, the family stood before it, their reflections warped in its corroded surface. They touched the cold metal, tracing the letters of the company logo with trembling fingers, as if searching for some remnant of him in the rust and salt. He was there, in the ghost of oil stains on the seat, in the faded scent of diesel that clung to the cab, and he was gone. Now, the forensic teams would take over. They would peel back the layers of time and tide, searching for answers in the bent frame and the faded logbooks. But for the family, the most critical question had already been answered. The waiting was over. The truth, no matter how harrowing, was finally theirs to hold. And in the days that followed, as they gathered his photographs and his favorite jacket, as they prepared to lay his memory to rest, they did so with a sorrow that was no longer laced with uncertainty. The ocean had spoken, and though its words were cruel, they were no longer silent. The moment the rusted hulk of the truck was hauled from the ocean's grasp, it wasn't just metal and rubber emerging from the depths. It was a time capsule of unanswered questions, sealed in salt and silence for half a decade. Forensic experts, clad in white suits that starkly contrasted the eerie patina of the rig, moved with deliberate precision, their gloved hands tracing the contours of a vehicle that had become a tomb of mysteries. Every scratch, every dent, every anomaly in the cab's structure was a potential whisper from the past, a clue left behind by a man who had vanished without so much as a distress call. The truck itself told a story before a single test was run. The driver's side door, warped and resistant, hinted at a violent force. Was it the crushing pressure of the ocean's descent, or something more sinister that had twisted the steel? The windshield, though cracked in a spiderweb of fractures, remained intact, a detail that puzzled investigators. If the rig had plunged from a great height, why hadn't it shattered entirely? And then there was the cabin's interior, where the scent of salt water mingled with something older, something faintly metallic, lingering, like the ghost of a moment frozen in time. Forensic pathologists turned their attention to the seat belts first. The driver's belt was locked in place, its mechanism jammed, as if it had been yanked with sudden, desperate force. Was this the frantic motion of a man bracing for impact, or had something or someone else triggered it? The steering wheel bore no signs of a frontal collision, yet the gear shift was bent at an unnatural angle, as though wrenched in a struggle. And then, the most chilling detail of all, the ignition was still in the on position. As the team began extracting samples, trace elements of rust, microscopic fibers, residues clinging to the dashboard, the lab hummed with a tension thick enough to cut. The ocean had scrubbed away fingerprints, but it couldn't erase the secrets embedded in the truck's bones. Paint transfers, barely visible to the naked eye, were scraped from the undercarriage, their origins unknown. A single, waterlogged logbook was found wedged beneath the seat, its pages swollen and illegible. Yet the very fact it was there at all suggested the driver had no intention of abandoning his rig. So what had gone so catastrophically wrong? The answers, if they existed, were hiding in the corrosion, in the bent frames, in the silent mechanical witnesses that had spent 5 years in the dark. And as the forensic team pieced together the fragments, one question loomed larger than the rest. Had the ocean claimed this man by accident, or had something far more calculated sent him into its depths? The truth was there, waiting in the rust and the ruins, but would it ever surface? The night swallowed James Holloway whole in 2002, leaving behind only questions that festered like an open wound for half a decade, until the ocean itself coughed up its grim secret. His rig, a hulking 18-wheeler, last seen rolling out of Dallas, under a sky thick with unspoken promises, now lay entombed in the silent dark, its rusted skeleton whispering of a fate too cruel to ignore. But how? The theories slither through the mind like shadows, each more unsettling than the last, each demanding scrutiny, each refusing to let go. First, there is the specter of an accident, a moment of human error stretched into eternity. Could Holloway, a man who knew those roads like the back of his calloused hands, have misjudged a turn on that fateful stretch of highway? The forensic teams poring over the truck's twisted remains noted the absence of skid marks, the lack of frantic braking that might suggest a last-ditch struggle for control. Yet the ocean doesn't lie. The rig's final resting place, miles from any known route, hints at a descent so sudden, so violent, it defies logic. Was it a bridge collapse, unrecorded and forgotten? A plunge into waters that swallowed both man and machine without a trace? The cold math of physics suggests possibility, but the heart rebels, because accidents leave clues, and 5 years of silence is a clue in itself. Then there is the darker thread, foul play. The trucking industry, a labyrinth of long hauls and longer nights, has its share of whispers, smuggling routes repurposed, debts called in, under cover of darkness, rivalries settled beyond the reach of the law. Holloway's logs, meticulous to a fault, showed no deviations until they stopped. His CB radio, recovered from the cab, held only static, where there should have been voices, friends, dispatchers, anyone. Did someone silence him mid-transmission? The timing is too precise, the disappearance too clean. But if this was murder, why stage it in the ocean's embrace? Unless the answer lies not in the how, but in the who. Someone with access to heavy equipment, to hidden docks, to the kind of power that bends metal and erases men. And what of the earth itself? The year 2002 was no stranger to nature's fury. Hurricanes carved new coastlines that summer, and the Gulf, restless and hungry, had been known to claim the unwary. Could a rogue wave, a storm surge unrecorded by weary meteorologists, have swept Holloway's rig off a flooded road? The saltwater corrosion on the truck's undercarriage tells a story of prolonged submersion, but the patterns are wrong, too uniform, too deliberate. The ocean doesn't cradle its victims with such care. It tears, it scatters, it devours. Yet here, the rig sits almost intact, as if placed with purpose. The truth, if it exists, is a needle in a haystack of horrors. Each theory pulls at the threads of reason, unraveling just enough to let the doubt seep in. The accident feels too neat, the foul play too sinister, the natural disaster too convenient. But perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the real terror isn't in the answering, but in the asking, because some questions aren't meant to be solved, they're meant to haunt. So tell me, when you hear the hum of an engine on a lonely highway, when the headlights cut through the dark like a blade, do you ever wonder what lies just beyond the beam? Do you ever listen for the echoes of a voice that was silenced too soon? The road remembers, the water remembers, and somewhere, in the space between what we know and what we fear, James Holloway is still waiting to be found. The ocean had guarded its secret for half a decade, until the rusted skeleton of the truck emerged from the depths, its cab still sealed, as if frozen in time. Now, as experts peeled back the layers of corrosion and salt, they uncovered not just metal and machinery, but fragments of a story that refused to stay buried. Forensic analysts traced the truck's final moments with chilling precision. The GPS data, recovered from a waterlogged black box, revealed a deviation from the planned route, a sharp turn toward the coast, followed by an abrupt halt near the edge of a crumbling cliffside road. But here's where the narrative fractured. The truck's weight distribution suggested it hadn't simply plunged. Something, or someone, had guided it into the water with deliberate force. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit conference room, the driver's sister clutched a faded photograph, her fingers trembling as investigators laid out the evidence. The technical details, torque patterns on the steering column, the angle of impact, meant little to her. What haunted her was the way his last known transmission cut mid-sentence. Not with panic, but with a quiet, unnatural calm. Like he knew, she whispered, her voice breaking. The contrast was brutal. Cold empirical data versus the raw, gnawing grief of those left behind. One expert theorized a mechanical failure, a catastrophic brake malfunction that sent the rig careening off course. Another pointed to the absence of skid marks, the lack of struggle, hinting at something far more sinister. Embedded in the truck's undercarriage was a sliver of foreign metal, its composition matching industrial-grade restraints used in cargo theft, rings active in the early 2000s. The implication hung heavy. This wasn't just an accident, it was a disappearance meticulously staged. Yet as the pieces clicked into place for the investigators, the families found no solace. The truth, it seemed, was another kind of abyss, one that didn't offer answers, only deeper questions. What had he seen in those final moments? Why had no one come forward in all these years? The tension in the air was palpable, a storm of unspoken fears and half-formed theories. For every clue that surfaced, another vanished beneath the weight of the unknown. And as the camera lingered on the sister's face, her tears reflecting the sterile glow of the evidence boards, one question remained, echoing like the tide against the shore. How does anyone move on when the past refuses to stay buried? Let that sink in, the space between what we know and what we'll never understand, because some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, they're meant to haunt us.